Good morning, everyone. So, this morning, we have Marcus Trotta, who's a hydrogeologist for the Sonoma County Water Agency Resource Planning Section. And he's going to talk to you about groundwater in the Santa Rosa Plain, which we are in right here. He's a professional geologist and certified hydrogeologist in the state of California. He received his bachelor in geology with an emphasis on hydrologic science at the University of California, Davis. So please welcome Marcus Trotta.
Great. Thank you, Pam. Working?
Yep.
Great. Thanks for having me here this morning. Thanks for the wonderful breakfast and the song. I wanted to sing for you here, so great. I'm going to talk to you about groundwater. It's what I specialize in at the Sonoma County Water Agency. I've been working on for 6 years, working on groundwater studies and management programs. I'm going to talk to you about what we're doing in the Santa Rosa Plain groundwater basin, and an upcoming action by our board of directors will be to consider adopting a groundwater management plan for this basin. So that'll be coming up in a couple of months, and I'll let you know what's involved in that and what's projected going forward. So I'm going to start out just with some groundwater basics, what groundwater is, what groundwater isn't, and I might need some help from your member here, Charlie Jetson, who probably has more experience than I do with groundwater here in the county. Then I'll talk about groundwater studies we've been doing here in the Santa Rosa Plain groundwater basin and how that's feeding into a local management program. And I'll try and get all that done in 25 minutes. So starting with the hydrologic cycle, groundwater is part of a larger hydrologic cycle. It starts out as precipitation falling on the ground, landing on the ground surface. Some of that water then evaporates back up into the atmosphere. Some of it soaks in and then gets sucked up by plants and gets evapotranspired back up into the atmosphere as well. Some of that water runs off into streams and rivers. And then what doesn't do one of those three things infiltrates into our groundwater basins and becomes part of the aquifers that feed our groundwater basins here in Sonoma County. What I'd like to convey in this diagram is how groundwater moves, and it often calls what we call recharge areas and flows what we call discharge areas, and oftentimes those discharge areas are streams or wetlands. This slide shows two basic different types of aquifers. And aquifers, they're not underground lakes. They're basically sand and gravel zones that have been deposited underground, or sometimes they're fractured rocks that allow water to move through it. And water moves really slowly through those aquifers. We often measure the rate of flow in rivers in feet per second. In groundwater aquifers, it's often feet per day, and moves very slowly compared to surface water. The light blue aquifer here is what we call an unconfined aquifer. It's usually the first aquifer that gets encountered, and it's directly connected with the atmosphere. Oftentimes there are confining units, which are often clay layers that restrict the movement of water into our deeper aquifers. And on the bottom is what we call a confined aquifer. That's an aquifer that's below a clay layer or some impermeable layer that is typically under pressure. And we can have different levels in those aquifers. So when we look at studying groundwater basins, we have to think in 3 dimensions. And we look at not just how things are horizontally, but also vertically. There can be big differences in groundwater levels, water quality at different depths in our groundwater basin. This just shows, again, how water moves through our aquifer system, starting out at recharge areas. And we can see the time scales associated with groundwater moving from these recharge areas to these discharge areas, which can range from days to years to, in some cases, centuries and millennia. Just a brief overview of the Sonoma County Water Agency. We're a wholesale water supplier for over 600,000 people in Sonoma and Marin County. We sell water to the larger cities and water districts in Sonoma and Marin County. Santa Rosa, Roanoke Park, Petaluma, Cotati, Sonoma, as well as North Marin customers. Sebastopol is actually not one of our customers. Sebastopol gets its water from its own groundwater wells. So Sebastopol is solely reliant on our local groundwater supplies. The vast majority of the water that we deliver to the other customers is sourced from the Russian River up near Forestville. We have a series of collector wells we come from, and that constitutes the majority of the water that we deliver. We deliver on average about 50,000 acre-feet per year to our customers. An acre-foot is basically the amount of water that would cover a football field in about a foot of water. We also have 3 wells in the Santa Rosa plant, one on Sebastopol Road here. You may see it coming on Highway 12. It's a big building with big blue pumps. We use those in years when our surface water supplies are a little more constrained. So in years where we have lots of flow in the river, we'll often let those wells rest so that they're allowed to replenish. So in years like this, when we are a little more constrained with the drought conditions, we have that supply available to supplement what we're not able to get from the river. We also do wastewater collection and treatment. We operate in a number of sanitation districts. We do flood protection services in many of the creeks and streams in the county. And we have a large environmental resources section that does a lot of fisheries and biological monitoring on the Russian River and its tributaries. So increasingly, we recognize the interconnection of our water supplies we have available to us and how connected our surface water and groundwater systems are. In addition, how important conservation is to helping us meet our demands and our water needs as a community. Recycled water is also an increasingly relied upon source of water. That's highly treated wastewater that can be reused for landscape irrigation or agricultural irrigation, and that's increasingly become important in many areas that can be used to offset the use of groundwater. Beginning in about 2000, kind of recognizing this connection, the Water Agency started partnering with the U.S. Geological Survey and doing groundwater studies of the larger basins in the county. And this started with studies in the Alexander Valley, shown in yellow, Sonoma Valley, shown in red. Those studies were completed in 2006. We just completed the study of the Santa Rosa Plain, which is what I'll be talking to you about today. That's in orange. And we're actually just kicking off a study in the Petaluma Valley groundwater basin this coming year. The overall goal is to better understand how our surface water systems relate to our groundwater systems and how we can best manage those together. The Santa Rosa Plain groundwater study was about a 7-year study all told. The first portion of it was published in July of 2013, and the second part was just published earlier this year. The last major studies of the basin were done about 30 years ago by the Department of Water Resources, so there's a big need to really update those studies with new information and new technology, and I'll describe those studies in a little more detail here. And those reports are available on our website if you're ever looking for some nighttime material to help you get to sleep. So any study of a groundwater basin has to start with its geology. The geology is what kind of governs how water moves through our underground aquifers. And as you're likely aware, we live in a very complex and tectonically active area, and it's recently evidenced by our earthquake. And just as an aside note, we actually, in Sonoma Valley, we have a groundwater management program. We have a number of wells we've been monitoring. We just went out yesterday to download data from those wells. We saw some pretty significant changes in groundwater levels associated with the earthquake. There's been streams in Sonoma Valley that were not flowing before the earthquake that started flowing. So there's really a connection between the geology and our water resources that was made obvious by that. So here in Santa Rosa Plain, this is the geologic map of the plain. Most of Sonoma County is made up of bedrock, which is fractured rock. It really doesn't yield large quantities of water to wells. In the Santa Rosa Plain, however, we have pretty thick deposits of sedimentary rocks and volcanic rocks that are capable of both storing and transmitting pretty large quantities of groundwater. So we have a pretty productive groundwater basin here that we overlie. The main geologic formations that are shown here are the alluvium Glen Allen formation that are shown in yellow. And these are mostly sands, gravels, and silts that have been deposited by rivers and streams in the valley areas. And they can form pretty productive aquifers. Those aquifers are also often connected with our surface water bodies, or streams and wetlands. And so they're really important in that regard. Other aquifers are the Petaluma formation, which is shown in dark brown. And you don't see it a lot at the surface here, but it actually underlies a large portion of the basin. And it's actually fairly clay rich. There are some gravel zones in it, but it's a little less productive than some of the other aquifers in the region. The Wilson Grove formation, which is shown in the light brown, is what Sebastopol sits at the top. It's an old sedimentary deposit, about 5 to 8 million years old. It's a very permeable formation. Many highly transmissive, highly productive wells are tap water from that particular formation. The Sonoma volcanics are shown in orange, and those are just an accumulation of different types of volcanic rocks, basalts and ash that's been deposited in wells in that formation can be really highly variable over time. The fault zones, as I mentioned, can be really important in terms of how groundwater moves. In some areas, faults can act as a barrier to groundwater flow. You get clays that form along fault zones, and they can stop groundwater water from flowing. And in some cases, you can get poor water quality moving up along fault zones. So it's important to understand where fault zones exist and how they relate to groundwater. This is what we call a conceptual model. It's basically, if you imagine taking a slice across the basin and tilting it up to see how the groundwater system looks in 3 dimensions. And so we have those geologic formations that I described shown here with the general direction of groundwater moving through the basin. In general, groundwater moves from the east, where we get most of our recharge in the Sonoma Mountain, in the hills of the east, across the plain and discharges to the laguna, to Santa Rosa. We have a lot of recharge occurring where streams come out of hills and moving through the basin. We also have discharge from wells. We have over 12,000 wells in the basin, so that can really change how groundwater moves across the basin. And we have creeks that both gain and lose water to the groundwater system. Part of the USGS study was developing a computer model of groundwater flow, and this is kind of a cutting-edge model they developed that included both the surface water and the groundwater system. And they take all these different data sets and put it into the model: precipitation, temperature records, where areas are paved, soil moisture, the geology, and data from all of the groundwater wells that they have access to that are within the Santa Rosa Plain. And then they're able to use that model to develop what we call a hydrologic budget, and I'll share that with you in a few slides. That basically estimates how much water is moving in an average year and how much water is moving out, and how that changes over time. It can also be used to identify where the groundwater system is being recharged, so that we can develop projects to kind of protect and enhance those recharge areas rather than having them paved over. You can use it to evaluate future water resource management strategies, look at the potential effects of future climate changes on our groundwater basin, and also how changes in land use may affect our groundwater system. So this is the groundwater budget that was developed by the USGS through the model, which is looking at how much water is flowing in. And using that model, they took an average time period from 1976 to 2010. So this is a 35-year period. And on average, about 80,000 acre-feet of water was flowing into that basin during an average year. And you can see that the majority of that is coming from surface percolation, so that's just water that's falling on the land, rainfall that's falling on the land surface and infiltrating directly into our aquifers. And then a large portion also comes from percolation through stream beds. And so it really highlights the importance of streams as sources of recharge to our groundwater basin. And then the 7,200 acre feet on the side, that's water moving in from adjacent groundwater basins. Outflows were estimated over that same time period as about 83,900 acre feet. And we see that the largest portion of that is from well pumping at about 35,000 acre feet on average per year. And the majority of that pumping is sourced from what we refer to as rural pumping. That includes both rural, residential, and agricultural irrigation. Make up a little over 80% of the total amount of pumping. Municipalities pump on average about 18% of that total. Stream bed discharge is another large portion of the groundwater budget. And so that's groundwater that's moving out of the aquifer into our streams and provide a base flow to help sustain flows of these streams during certain times of the year. Groundwater evapotranspiration, that's basically roots of plants that are reaching into the shallow aquifers and evaporating that water out into the atmosphere. Surface leakage is basically water that's flowing into springs and springs that occur within the basin. And then the amount of outflows to other basins is roughly equal to the amount that's coming in from the sides. So you see there's a difference between the total inflows and outflows, and that's about 3,300 acre feet per year. And that's what we refer to as a change of storage. So that's water that's being removed from the groundwater basin over time. And on average, that's about 3,300 acre feet per year. So the model is also used to look at some potential future changes to the climate change scenarios. They looked at some of the current models of how the climate is projected to change over the coming years. And they ran some different models and found that on average, we're likely to expect increased pumpage over time as temperatures are projected to increase. That's going to lead to increased demands of water. We have higher needs of plants and crops, so there'll be more water needed for that. Municipalities, there's projections to increase pumping over time. And so that all leads to an overall lowering of groundwater levels in the basin. And with that, you can get reduced flows to streams, so that can cause reduced stream flows is one of the things that they see as being a potential consequence of this. And then more losing stream reaches over time. And so in order to address some of those issues, to date, there really hasn't been a comprehensive statewide groundwater regulation or permitting system. There has actually been some pretty monumental changes to that just over the last month or so. Just 2 days ago, actually, the state legislature passed a series, a groundwater bill that's going to set kind of a framework for statewide groundwater regulations. And so our approach has been to develop plans locally, because we think that a local perspective and knowledge is the best way to manage our resources. And it's really pretty well in line with what the state is promoting. They're promoting locals to manage their own groundwater basins. But if the locals fail or are unwilling to manage their water resources, this new legislation provides a framework for the state to step in and do that for them until they're able to turn it back over to the locals, basically. It's all really, really recent, but we think that what we've put together will really help us put us ahead of a lot of other areas in terms of being able to comply with those new requirements and regulations. So other benefits of local management of our groundwater resources, this includes raising the awareness of groundwater for the public. A lot of members of the public really don't understand groundwater, why they need to conserve their well water during times to help them get through times of drought. Increased coordination of stakeholders. There's a lot of different agencies that have jurisdiction over groundwater, and having a groundwater management plan can really help coordinate those different efforts. Also puts us in a good position to get funding from the state for water projects and groundwater studies. Just a little background and overall timeline of our plan. We actually started planning in the Santa Rosa Plain back in 2009 with a stakeholder assessment. We worked with a facilitation group out of California State University that came out and interviewed a number of stakeholders with interest in groundwater in the region. And they made some recommendations on how to proceed. Based on that, we developed a steering committee that explored different types of groundwater management. There's different ways to manage groundwater: voluntary, non-regulatory, kind of local plans. You can, some basins are managed through court adjudications, and some have like formal agreements amongst agencies. The steering committee recommended a voluntary, non-regulatory approach. Did a bunch of public outreach during that time frame, and then convened a basin advisory panel in 2011. It's met 23 times, beginning in December 2011, to develop the groundwater management plan. I'll give you a slide later that shows the composition of that panel. The USGS study forms a real central piece to any groundwater management. You want your management actions and decisions to be really made on sound science. So the data we get from that program is really important. Just this last May, we did a series of public meetings, had over 200 members of the public attend to kind of explain what the groundwater management plan is and what the implementation is likely to look at. And then the Basin Advisory Panel, just at its last meeting in August, recommend that we take the plan that was ready to take it to our board of directors to consider for adopting. The plan is, the contents of the plan include a section on the water resources describing the groundwater basin, goals and objectives to help us manage the groundwater basin, management components that describe some of the specific actions, and then an implementation program to make it all happen. The Basin Advisory Panel, the facilitation group, recommended the composition of the panel to have a really broad array of stakeholders in order to capture the diverse water users in our basin. And so we really have it's about a 30-member panel. We have members of the general public, governmental agencies, including the cities, just individual well owners, natural resource managers, environmental organizations, tribal representatives, as well as other smaller water companies. The goal of the plan is fairly lofty. It's basically to manage and protect our groundwater resources by non-regulatory measures for the benefit of all users for the present and into the future. The components include continued stakeholder involvement and continued meetings. These meetings are open to the public. We have a website that describes where they are, when they are, and what the agendas are. Monitoring and modeling really is one of the key components of groundwater management. So it's setting up a monitoring system to track water levels over time, to look at things like how our surface water and groundwater interaction may change over time. Groundwater protection is really important. Water quality is really just as important as the amount of water that's in the groundwater system. Increasing conservation and efficiency is another key component. We have a lot of really strong conservation programs for the cities and urban areas, but there really aren't any funded programs available to just rural well owners, and that's something that we think is really important. We actually just got a grant to extend some of that conservation out to the rural areas beginning, I think, this year. Increasing groundwater recharge is a recommended component, as well as recycled water, water reuse, and integrating groundwater management planning activities. The management structure, we have our jurisdictional partners, the water agencies agency. And then the Basin Advisory Panel, stakeholder representatives will continue on and really guide the implementation of the program. And we also have a technical committee that advises the Basin Advisory Panel. So that's my last slide. The next steps, we had the Basin Advisory Panel August 14th ready to recommend the plan for adoption. We had 26 yes votes, 1 no, and 1 member absent. Our board will consider adopting the plan in October, probably either the 7th or the 14th at their normal Tuesday board meeting. And then we'll begin implementing the plan, and initially we'll be focusing on our monitoring program. So in addition to groundwater levels, groundwater quality, surface water groundwater interaction, and the potential for land surface subsidence. Those are all required water components by the water code. And then we'll be doing some additional computer simulations looking at what strategies we can use to help us sustain our groundwater resources into the future, and continuing again with the stakeholder coordination and public outreach, and making more information available to the public through our website. And we'll also, the actual plan should be on our website within the next couple weeks or so if you're interested in taking a look at what is actually in the plan.
Thank you very much, Marcus.
How bleak is it?
Well, it really depends where you're at. If you're an individual well owner, one of the lessons that we've learned from this drought is how diverse our water supplies are throughout the county. You know, if you're in the upper river of the Rush River Basin and above Lake Sonoma, things are looking a little sketchy because our reservoir up there, Lake Mendocino, is a lot smaller, so there's less reliability there. If you're downstream of Lake Sonoma and you have municipal water supplies, you're in pretty good shape now, but if things continue, we're concerned for next year. And if you're an individual well owner, it depends really where you're at in the basin. There's a lot of wells that have been, the groundwater levels have actually been fairly stable through the drought. But if you're in some of these more water scarce areas, fractured rock, or where the aquifers are a little thinner, and you have a shallow well, things can be a little frightening right now. Well owners are often, that's their only source of supply, and drilling a new well is quite expensive, and so it's definitely bleak for many. This is the bleakest it's been since the late 70s.
So how low is the water table gone? Is it scary? What's going on?
Again, in response to the drought, if it would depend on your well depth. If you have a 40-foot well, in some areas it's common for there's been a 20-foot more drop in groundwater levels. In Sonoma Valley, where we're doing monitoring, there's actually been long-term declines of groundwater levels out there that the drought has really exacerbated, and there we've seen drops over 30 years of 100 feet or more.
Thank you very much. Our tasks for you. One is you do a graphic, and all this money. And it occurs to me that once again I didn't bring deck of cards. So
today is the winner.
Ace of spades?
yeah, if you draw a card, and I'll think of a number.
Read off the number?
The last 4 digits.
Last 4 digits are 841.
I got it. Yay!
Yeah.
Yay! That nice glass of wine you're gonna get, girlfriend. Right there. Come on.
Okay. Now,
Okay, so I went.
well, I'm thinking of another. You have to guess the exact number, and it's a number between 1 and 10. So take the best shot. Yeah.
3.
Close.
Very close.
Thanks for playing. That's not yours. This
Where's the
was,
box?
oh, no, you don't get that because you didn't.
September,
Wow.
It's a beautiful one. Wonderful one.
It's her baby.
This one is for you.
Really?
This is our Pinot Photo. It's bottled by John Belletto, which I love. The wine in there actually won an award. Gold award. And each of those bottles goes with a donation to Pinot Photo. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Paula. Quick joke.
Guy's driving around the back of his Mountain and he sees a sign in front of a broken down shanty style house that says, "Top your dog for sale." He rings the bell. He rings the bell. He rings the bell and the owner appears and tells him the dog is in the backyard. The guy goes back to the backyard and sees a nice Labrador retriever sitting there. He says, "You talk?" And the lab replies, "Yep." The guy's in shock. He can't believe he heard this dog talk. After he recovers from the shock, he says, "So what's your story?" And the lab looks up and says, "Well, I discovered I could talk when I was pretty young. I wanted to help the government, so I told the CIA. In no time at all, they had me jetting from country to country, sitting in rooms with spies and world leaders, because no one figured a dog would be eavesdropping. I was one of their most valuable spies for 8 years running, but the jetting around was getting tiresome, and I knew I wasn't getting any younger, so I decided to settle down. I signed up for a job at the airport to do some undercover security. I uncovered some incredible dealings, and I was awarded a batch of medals. I got married, had a mess of puppies, and now I'm just retired." The guy is just amazed. He goes back to the owner and asks what he wants for the dog. $10. And he goes, $10? This dog is amazing. Why on earth are you willing to sell him so cheap? Because he's a liar. He's never been out of the backyard.
Thank you, Joe.